So this is the last day of our 7-day spring retreat. I've enjoyed Shikan has given several talks during the retreat on the Hara Sutra, which have been wonderful, and Sensei's given a couple of talks. I particularly remember her first talk on what made quite an impression on me, the community, I think it was Wyoming, or that was building community by telling stories. And then they were activists and were actively advocating various kinds of alternative energy solutions. And they ran into a politician in their state who was in the pocket of the oil lobby, and was very rude to them and called them names like hippy dippies and things. And they asked him what his story was. And then they listened. And in that act of listening to him, he eventually told his story of growing up as in a poor county that was where the primary activity was drilling for oil and being put down by other people all his life. And that really, that's moving to me, that by just listening, we can heal divisions that we think are, that we're not able to heal. And we're so divided now as a country. So the power of listening is something. And then we had this memorial service this morning for the 8 people killed in Atlanta. And we've really reached some kind of boiling point where we have to stand up and say something, because and as I said at the end of the service, most of us here are white. June is Asian American, a Japanese American, raised in Hawaii. And I think those of us that are white just don't realize really what it's like to be a person of color in this country right now, especially an Asian American, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Filipino. And because if you're an Asian American right now in this country, you don't feel safe. And we don't know that. There's no way that we really know that, because we don't experience. I walk down the street and go to Pete's or something, and I don't worry about someone hitting me or robbing me, or it could happen, but it hasn't. And that's not my experience, but it is the experience of many Asian Americans in this country right now. So we have to stand up and be allies to Asian Americans and say enough is enough, and words matter, and people should not be using the kind of words that have contributed to this kind of awful scapegoating of Asian Americans. It's just not acceptable, and we need to stand up and say so in any way that we can. So I'm glad we did the memorial service. There is so much grief about this, so much sadness around this kind of racism that's happening. It's very ugly. Fortunately, we have a practice that allows us to create a container for that, for us to bear witness to our own grief or anger or whatever it is. And that's important, that we have rituals where we can give form to something that's healing, and that puts forth a loving intention that can heal hatred. Hatred is not healed with more hatred. So I'm very happy that to have done this retreat with all of you. I'm really grateful to have your support, to support my practice so that I could sit. And I thought I would talk about emptiness this more. I hardly ever talk about emptiness. In fact, I always say, you know, Aiken Roshi said, if you meet a Zen teacher that goes on and on about emptiness, you should just run as fast as you can in the opposite direction. But I'm going to do that this morning. So if you want to run in the opposite direction, feel free to. But I don't usually talk too much about emptiness, but since Shikan talked about the Heart Sutra, I feel like it is important to clarify this very important teaching in our tradition. The other thing that came up was about mantras, and I want to say a little bit about mantras. We chanted the Daishin Dharani this morning, which we used to chant in the evenings in our retreats. We haven't chanted it for a long time, but it's often done in our tradition at funerals. And it's not generally transmitted because it's Dharani is like a mantra. And I'm not sure that the Daishin Dharani is actually sacred seed syllables. But the idea of a mantra is that you have a phenome, a sound that is representing something sacred, and the sound itself is important. It's not and so like an example would be Om. The mantra Om consists of 3 phenomes. Ah, U, and each of those phenomes represents a different state of consciousness. So in India, the Upanishads were the first really major development where they moved from a kind of rigid ritual Brahmanistic practices to meditation and exploring different states of consciousness. And they speak in the Upanishads of 4. And they go, now we don't speak of consciousness in this way in the West, but in the Upanishads, they speak of consciousness as going from gross to subtle states. And then of course, if we actually want to get into the weeds and talk about what is actually consciousness, that's a very difficult conversation to have. But according to the Upanishads, there's 4 states of consciousness. There's our waking consciousness, which is generally characterized by being restless. And I think you can probably all relate to that. One of the reasons we sit is so that we can bring some peace to our restlessness. We are restless, 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 never at ease. You know that feeling when you're on social media and you're thumbing things and you can't get enough, but you've got enough, but you don't know what to do, so you just keep doing it. We just get busy. So that's our waking consciousness. And then the second, and these go from gross to more subtle, the second is our dream consciousness. When we're dreaming, when we fall asleep, we dream every night, and we are attracted to images and situations in our dreams, and when we're dreaming, we experience the dream as real. Now, there's the other possibility of waking up in the dream, which is a Tibetan practice, which can be, I've tried to do it. I haven't been successful, but I think Sensei does it occasionally. And that's a very powerful thing you can do in a dream. But a dream is more subtle consciousness than waking consciousness. And then the Upanishads talk about a third consciousness, deep sleep, when we're not dreaming. And we have deep sleep every night. And in deep sleep, we're sort of, it's kind of an absorption in self, but there's no duality there. So it's very subtle. And we wouldn't remember deep sleep particularly when we wake up. But it's actually very important to have good, when we talk about having a good night's sleep, the chances are you've had a good night's sleep because you had you were doing deep sleeping for part of the night. So Om refers to those three states of consciousness. And it's a sacred Vedic symbol, which is identified with all that is. So that's why it's sacred. It's the past, the present, and the future, and anything else beyond that. So Om is waking consciousness, U is dream state, and is deep sleep. That's a mantra. And then the Upanishads talk about a fourth state, which is not in the mantra because it has no phenome, because it's the silence from which everything arises. And that is spoken of as luminous awareness, luminosity, where there is no trace of self in this consciousness or awareness. It's very subtle. And the Tibetans speak of this as a state that we often experience at the time of death, when we're dying. And there's some debate about luminous consciousness, as you can imagine. Is it located in the brain somewhere, or is it outside? Who knows? So that's the idea of a mantra, is that the syllable is sacred, and the phenomes are sacred because they are conveying something about reality that's large and beyond just our gross consciousness, so to speak. So that brings us to this teaching of Shunyata, very important teaching that people struggle with and often misunderstand. It's okay. It's not an easy teaching to come to terms with, and people in our tradition spend years and years and years trying to clarify what this teaching is. And if you look at koans and teachings in our tradition, they're almost all about this in one way or another. So let me give you a quote about this from Trungpa, which I was very happy to hear Sensei quoting a lot. As you may know, Trungpa was one of my root teachers, and he had a huge impact on my life. I was very, very fortunate to be able to study with him. He was brilliant. And so Trungpa said this about Shunyata. Shunyata is neither religious nor secular. It is not particularly sacred. Neither is it profane. It is what it is. However, it covers a lot of ground. It is the first clear thinking and conclusion about reality in the history of the human mind. That's a pretty bold statement. It's the first clear thinking and conclusion about reality in the history of the human mind. So we have this Heart Sutra that we chant in our services, and it is a pith instruction. It's a one page of a summation of I think it's 80 volumes, are the complete Prajnaparamita Sutras. And those are all condensed down into this one thing, one page that we call the Heart Sutra that we chant in our services. And all Zen centers, pretty much anywhere in the world, chant the Heart Sutra. So it starts out, the setting is Shariputra is talking to Avalokiteshvara. And Shariputra is asking about this emptiness. And Shariputra represents, as Shikan said, what Shikan called the first turning of the wheel. Shariputra represents the early teachings of Buddhism, which we all have some acquaintance with: the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, Five Skandhas, dependent origination. And the early, as marvelous as the, I don't want to disparage the early Buddhist teachings because they're quite remarkable, but they're also, there's a tendency to be very analytical in the early teachings. And when you get to something like the Abhidharma, they start to actually reify the smallest thing they can find, which they call a dharma. So in the Heart Sutra, we have Shariputra representing this analytical teaching of early Buddhism. And they understood emptiness as being applying to the self, that the self was empty, but they did not believe that the phenomenal world was empty. So the later Mahayana teachings that develop are what we call twofold emptiness. That is, both the subjective self is empty and the phenomenal world is empty. And from the Mahayana point of view, both of those need to be appreciated to be fully liberated from suffering. In other words, we have some sense that there's an objective world out there that's real. And if we're highly deluded, we have quite a strong attachment to this, what we call self, and that we identify with, and we have a name and all the things that go with that. But again, from the point of view of these teachings on shunyata, the self that we are attached to is completely empty, is not self-existing, and the phenomenal world is not objectively real in the way that we think it is. It is also empty. The Four Noble Truths, the rock of Buddhism. These things can become like doctrines. Bernie called it the Four Opinions. But, you know, it's just my opinion, so. So at the time that Buddha taught, there was this notion in India that there was a divine self. It was a very common teaching in India, and that was known as Atman. And the notion was that there was a soul, that the self had some essence called a soul that survived after we die, and then that soul would take over and occupy another body in rebirth. And the Buddha rejected that teaching completely. The Buddha said the self has no essence. It doesn't have a soul in that sense. The self exists based on conditions. And that's where he came up with the teaching of Paticca that one thing leads to another. Everything is interrelated. And in the Paticca you have these 12 nidanas, starting with ignorance. And then first you have to start with ignorance. And when you have ignorance, that leads to the next condition. which is volitional impulses. And volitional impulses lead to sensual consciousness, which leads to name and form, which leads to the sixfold senses, which leads to contact, feeling, craving, clinging, grasping, becoming, birth, old age, death. That's another way of talking about shunyata. Shunyata is saying that there is nothing here that's self-existing. And unlike the Abhidharma, the teaching of shunyata would say there is no dharma which is self-existing. There is no objective world out there that's self-existing. Everything is interrelated. And we can appreciate that the nature of suffering is that we are attached to this self, and those conditions, starting with ignorance, lead to further and further suffering. So the idea here is that if you really begin to appreciate the nature of reality as it actually is, which is completely interrelated, everything is a process interrelated with each other. There's no self-existing eternal essence anywhere to be found, then we can relax a little bit. So what is, when you say something is empty, it has to be empty of something. If my glass of water is empty, then it doesn't have any water in it. So what is emptiness empty of? Well, it's empty of self, the self. So Buddha taught what we call the middle path. And essentially what we mean by the middle path is a teaching that avoids the two extremes of eternalism, some sense that there's some essence that is real and self-existing, but also the other extreme of nihilism. Also, Buddha rejected both of those teachings, and both of them were common in India at the time. And the nihilistic way would be more of a kind of a materialistic view of the world. Everything is just materials and nothing matters. So you can do whatever you want. That's not what the Buddha taught. The Buddha said it matters what you do. Because, and this is the thing that I think, to me, is that you can understand Buddhism as a religion with metaphysics, and that's okay. That's one way of looking at Buddhism, and at times it's important to appreciate what a religion can bring through faith and some sense of equanimity and a strong spiritual practice. But I think in many ways, the nature of the Buddhist teachings was very down to earth. And a lot of the things that become enshrined as doctrines happened later. But the Buddha was basically saying things like, if what you're doing works, then continue doing it. But if it doesn't work, then stop doing it. And I think he was practical in that way. And I think we have tried at our Zen Center to develop practical upayas that help you negotiate your life psychologically, spiritually, physically, mentally. And I think that I can think, the story where a woman loses her child and she's just beside herself with grief, and she goes to the Buddha to ask for guidance. And he says, well, go into the village and get a mustard seed from some family that hasn't lost a child. And she goes in the village, she knocks on the first door, and she says, like to get a mustard. The Buddha asked that I get a mustard seed from you if you haven't lost a child. And they said, oh, come in and sit down, and I'll give you some tea and tell you about my child that I lost last year. And she went throughout the village and she found that she couldn't get a mustard seed because everyone had lost a child. And she came back to the Buddha, with a totally different perspective. And Shakyamuni Buddha did those kind of teachings a lot, kind of really down to earth, practical things. And I think there wasn't Buddhism before Buddha. It wasn't a religion. It became a religion. And I don't want to disparage. Is that a word? I don't want to be derogatory about the depth and possibilities of Buddhism as a religion and the metaphysics that go with it. But in many ways, Buddhism is a very practical, down-to-earth, empirical way of looking at the world that might not need the metaphysics that often go with it. So, in the Heart Sutra, we have this very famous pith instruction in the sutra, which says, "Form is emptiness, emptiness is form." That's really the kernel of the whole thing. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. But then the sutra goes on and says, "Therefore, in emptiness, there is neither form, nor feelings, nor perceptions, nor mental formations, nor consciousness, no eye, ear, nose, or tongue, or body, or mind." Now, that's a very odd translation. And I think actually somewhat confusing, because it just said there's no form. It just said emptiness is form, and now it's saying it's no form. So which is it? So the sutra actually contradicts itself. And if you think there's no form, you might end up thinking, and not unjustifiably, that then nothing exists. Maybe that's what emptiness is about. But that would be kind of a nihilistic way of appreciating it, kind of like the nothingness of existentialism. What did they call it in existentialism? They had another word for it, the void. And often that has been equated with shunyata, but I don't think they're the same. The idea of the void in existentialism is that nothing is real, nothing exists. That's not exactly this teaching of shunyata is more subtle. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. What that line is meant to convey, because this sutra is a response to Shariputra, who represents that very, remember what I just said was in the early teachings, there was a tendency to reify, like they would, in the early teachings on the Abhidharma, there's teachings of the 5 skandhas, which are a way of understanding the self. And skandha actually just means a stack of stalks that are stacked together. And basically, the 5 skandhas are a way of appreciating the psychological development of ego, or how we construct a self. We start with form, we go to, it's almost like what we just did with the dependent origination. You have form, feeling, sensation, concept, consciousness. It's a process of increasingly solidifying a self. But in the early teachings, they understood that they thought that each of those 5 skandhas had its own self-existence. So in a way, the Heart Sutra is a critique of that. And what the Heart Sutra is saying when it says there's no form, no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, it's saying that there's no self-existence in any of those. Our eye doesn't exist unto itself. It exists in our eye socket, in our brain, along with our ears and our nose and our mouth, and they all work together. You can't have a human without eye, ear, nose, tongue. We have to have them all. You can't have a house without windows and doors and a foundation and a roof and hopefully a chimney if you're in a cold climate. So you have a fireplace. A house has to have those things to be a house. Tables have to have legs. If you take the legs off a table, it's no longer a table, it's just a piece of wood. So everything is interconnected. And I think that's what the Heart Sutra is getting at when it says, no eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. It's saying the eye doesn't, none of these things is self-existing unto themselves. But it's not saying that there's no form. It's not saying that emptiness means you don't exist, because clearly you do. I can see you all and you can see me. We all have bodies. We all can talk. We all do things. We exist. It's so, and yet we don't exist in the way that we misidentify how we are existing. If we really try to speak about the ultimate truth of the reality of being a human being here, we have to appreciate that everything here is impermanent and changing all the time. And we are changing along with everything else. So we're not a noun, we're a verb. We're more like a process. We're a work in progress. And hopefully as we get older, we get a little bit more loving and kind and compassionate, and maybe we hopefully develop a little wisdom with age. So emptiness doesn't mean there's nothing here. Emptiness means there's, you can't have, if you can't blow up a balloon without there being air in the balloon. The balloon doesn't exist unto itself. It exists because you blow it up and now there's air in the balloon and that makes a balloon. Emptiness makes everything possible. Without emptiness, there would be nothing. There would be nothing without emptiness. There would be no freedom. There would be no growth. We couldn't grow. We would just be some solid mass of bone or something. An acorn couldn't become an oak tree. We should be happy there's impermanence. It means that everything can change. And so does shunyata. Shunyata means we can be free to love. We could fill the world with love and compassion because of emptiness. If emptiness was not the way the world is, nothing would be possible. That's what Trungpa was saying when he said that emptiness is the first clear thinking in the history of the world about the nature of reality. Now, the subtle thing here is that now when you hear this, you want to make that emptiness into some kind of ontological ground. And that's not what it is, because now you would be reifying it again. It's subtle. It's a subtle teaching. And our minds are often not geared to be subtle in that way, because we want to hang on to something. We want to create a ground or a concept out of reality, but reality or emptiness really defies that kind of wanting to solidify it and nail it down. There is no so if you think emptiness or shunyata is some kind of ontological foundation, then you've all of a sudden made it into some kind of essence again, and that's not the point. So what is required of us in our tradition to come to terms with this profound teaching of shunyata is to penetrate into this teaching. It's not enough to understand it or understand my words. You actually have to penetrate and find out for yourself the meaning of this teaching and get it or grok it on all levels to the point where it is intimate. You are intimate with this teaching. Another way of saying that is being intimate with not knowing. We say not knowing is the most intimate. So we can't know this teaching because the minute you try to know it, now there's somebody who's knowing something, and now you created a duality which leads to some kind of fixations, fixing, again, solidifying the self. And this teaching defies all of that. So if we really penetrate and reflect and inquire into our lives through this practice over and over and over again, you begin to appreciate that even your body you don't own. We need to take care of this body. It's the temple that we have that allows us to wake up and appreciate our lives. But the body that we have is given to us by over thousands and thousands of years of evolution. The DNA in our body, your body, comes from your ancestors. And without your ancestors, you wouldn't be here. Without that DNA, you wouldn't exist. So we're already completely interdependent with our ancestors who are no longer here. We're carrying on their DNA. And if you have kids, your kids will carry on your genes and your DNA. The breath. Now, as you probably all know, I love Chinese philosophy. I particularly love Taoism, and I love Chinese medicine because they say the whole universe is nothing but breath. And it doesn't matter what level you're talking about, whether you're talking about the cosmos and the stars, or you're talking about the biosphere, it's all breath. It's all the movement of yang and yin. And that movement creates the fabric of the universe. It's called qi. Most of that qi is not, we can't see it. About 4% we see, and that's the material world that we see. The rest is not seen. So even we don't own the breath. The breath is, we breathe because we're able to breathe, and we have oxygen because there's trees, and we have this, we live on this just amazing planet, which is our home in space, that creates oxygen that allows us to breathe. So the breath is not, you don't own the breath either. You don't really own anything, really. Your body is made up of rivers and streams and mountains in your body. I won't go into the body, but if you start exploring how many bacteria and viruses are already in our body, it's beyond what I can measure, that's for sure. So I think what this teaching is getting at in a very practical way, that is not meant to be just some esoteric teaching for a few mystics. It's meant for all of us to appreciate that if we don't see this, what this teaching is pointing at, then we're going to divide our world, as people do, into this and that, into good and evil. And then we won't appreciate that the flower, in order to have a flower, you got to have garbage. You can't have a flower without garbage. And you can't have garbage without the flower. But we live in a world in which we think of the other side as garbage and ourselves as a flower. And that's delusion. And that creates hatred, suffering, violence, war, all the things that we're familiar with. So I think the good news about Shunyata is you don't have to understand it to trust the universe. You don't have to know what the universe is to trust it, that it is basically good and something wonderful that we're a part of, and we belong here, and we're part of this sacred universe and world, and what an amazing thing this is. And we could really be grateful, even though we have all kinds of difficulties and challenges. In the end, we've been born into these bodies. It's very precious, and we have this opportunity to really appreciate some important sacred nature of the world that we're living in. But we can't know it. And because you can't know it doesn't mean it's not true. So we are imprisoned in our ideas of good and evil. Our minds are dualistic. We tend to fall into these categories very easily, and we create enemies, and we create the other side, whoever they are, the other, and then we demonize them and we scapegoat them, and that leads to all the things that we're experiencing, that have been experienced throughout human history. We're not unique. This has happened from the beginning. So I want to finish by telling you a story about the Buddha and Mara. As you may know, Mara was the demon that tempted the Buddha when he was almost at the point of reaching enlightenment, sitting under the Bodhi tree. Mara came and tempted him, trying to stop him from reaching enlightenment with all kinds of seductions. He was trying to distract the Buddha from his reaching enlightenment. So one day, the Buddha was in his cave, and Ananda, who was Buddha's disciple and his attendant, Ananda, who was standing outside near the cave, or the door of the cave, and suddenly Ananda saw Mara coming. And he was surprised that Mara would even have the gall to show up here after what he had done, what he had tried to do to the Buddha. And he didn't want that. He wished that Mara wouldn't notice him and would go away. But Mara walks straight up to Ananda and announces himself and says he'd like to see the Buddha. Well, Ananda says, "Why have you come here? Don't you remember that long ago you were defeated by the Buddha under the Bodhi tree? Aren't you ashamed to come here? Go away. The Buddha will not see you. You are evil. You are the enemy." So when Mara heard this, he began to laugh and laugh. And he said, "Didn't you say your teacher has no enemies?" So he caught Ananda in a trap there. And Ananda didn't know what to say. because he was kind of embarrassed because he realized that he knew that his teacher said all the time that he didn't have any enemies. So Nanda was kind of crestfallen here. And so he had to go and announce Mara to the Buddha. And he was hoping the Buddha would say, go and tell him I'm not here. Just tell him I'm in a meeting, a really important meeting. But when Ananda announced that Mara was there, Buddha was actually very happy when he heard that Mara had come. Such a very old friend had come to visit him. It's Mara? Oh, well, let him come in. And the Buddha said, and Ananda was continued to be really distressed by the whole thing. He was really stressed out. And so when Mara came in, Buddha stood up to greet him, and he, as if he was a special guest, and he invited him to sit down in a place of honor, and he took his hand in his in the warmest way and said, and the Buddha said, hello, Mara, how are you? How have you been? How's it been going for you? Is everything all right? So Buddha asked Ananda to make a very special herbal tea for his guest, his honored guest. And Ananda thought, well, I'm happy to make tea for my master 100 times a day, but making one cup of tea for Mara is just miserable. But since he was ordered by his master to make the tea, he did so. He couldn't refuse. So as Ananda was preparing the tea, the Buddha and Mara had this conversation, and the Buddha repeats very warmly, he says, well, how have you been? How are things with you? And Mara said, well, to tell you the truth, things aren't going so well. I'm tired of being Mara, as a matter of fact. I want to be someone else. Maybe someone like you, because, you know, wherever you go, large crowds of people follow you and bow down to you, and they really like you, and they give offerings to you. And I'd like to be like you. And hearing that, because see, Ananda was listening at the outside the room. He was kind of wanting to hear what they would say. So Ananda heard that, and Ananda felt kind of frightened. The idea that Mara would become the Buddha and Buddha might become Mara, that was like terrifying to Ananda. And so Mara continues and says to the Buddha, he says, you know, being Mara is not a very easy thing to do. If you talk, you have to talk in riddles. And if you do anything, you have to be kind of tricky and sly, and you have to look evil. And I'm tired of all that. But what I really can't bear is my disciples. They are now talking about social justice, peace, equity, liberation, non-duality, non-violence, all of that. Before, they used to listen to everything I told them. Now they are in revolt. The commanders of my army are demanding to do sitting meditation. Can you imagine? They want to practice mindfulness. They want to do walking meditation. They want to eat in silence and protect life. They want to protect the environment and the earth. They're just driving me crazy. So I've had enough of it. I think it would be better if I hand them over to you. I want to be someone else. Maybe we should change roles. And at this, when Ananda heard this, he began to shudder. So the Buddha listened attentively to Mara without interrupting him, because he was a good listener. And the Buddha was filled with compassion. And finally he said in a quiet voice, he said, yeah, do you think it's fun being the Buddha? You don't know what my disciples have done to me. They put words in my mouth that I never said. They build garish temples and put statues of me on altars in order to attract bananas and sweet rice just for themselves. And you know, the worst thing of all is they package me and make my teachings into an item of commerce. Mara, if you knew what it was really like to be a Buddha, I'm sure you wouldn't want to be one. So that's a story of Buddha and Mara. But again, just to the point being that if we really, really understand someone's human experience, it's very hard to demonize them and turn them into an enemy. When we were working with the peacemakers, Zen peacemakers in Israel, it was we often would say, and the Palestinians would say this too, you know, if both sides would just sit down and have a meal together, we wouldn't have all this conflict. Maybe if we just stopped using social media and we went out once we can do so and had meals with the people that we demonize, we wouldn't have so much conflict. So that's my talk for today. We have a little time for some discussion about any of this. Any questions, comments, stories? Anything? Sky? Keegan?
Emptiness is a very hard topic to communicate about, but I think you've done it in a really both subtle and practical and marvelous way today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Keegan. Karen?
Yeah, when you were talking about emptiness and the not conceptualizing it in your own experience as a in your study and so on, when did you begin to feel that you were, I know the term is not correct, say grasping it, because it's not something that we grasp necessarily, but that you began to understand what it meant? Was there like an epiphany beginning to?
You know, people often have very dramatic stories about the kind of openings they have, or kenshos or satoris. I have no story like that. My own particular development was gradual, and I couldn't pinpoint an exact point, Karen, at which I had some clarity about this teaching, but I did a lot of koan study, and I struggled a lot with koans, and I felt most of that time pretty stupid. In fact, when I first passed Mu, I didn't even know I had passed it. When my teacher said I'd passed it, I felt guilty because I didn't know what I had passed. And it took me months to kind of come to terms with that. And then I still feel like I'm inadequate. And I think that, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, I can't help you. I can't identify a specific event or thing. It's just happened over years and years of practicing that it has become something that I have no doubt about anymore. And I'm not trying to understand it because it's already here and I don't need to. But I do think it's an important teaching, and I think it's really at the heart of much of our teaching. And there's, if you can't understand the emptiness, then you can probably understand the idea of impermanence or no self. So we can get stuck on the word emptiness too. Again, it's because we want to turn it into a doctrine or a philosophy or something. But I think everyone can begin to kind of get a sense that the self that we think is so solid is not quite so solid, and that we're going to die someday. And so we're all kind of dealing with our mortality. And that's why people come to religion, because they feel afraid that they're going to die and they don't know what's going to happen after they die. So that's what religions do, is they help people deal with those kinds of questions. So I think one way to approach these teachings is just to approach the teachings that work for you, that you can understand and that you can integrate into your daily life. That, again, I think the point here is to be practical, and I would say empirical. And one of the things, again, I like about Taoism, which is a part of Zen, it had a huge influence on Zen, is that it's very empirical. The Chinese philosophy and Chinese medicine is based on a kind of natural science, because they observed the world around them in a very precise way. And they didn't need metaphysics to come up with their notion of the cosmos and the breath and yin and yang and all of that. They came up with that because they observed nature very intimately, and they were intimately connected with nature in their world. So I kind of approach the teachings that way. I think you take what works for you in your daily life that's practical, and then you kind of struggle and inquire into the things that seem opaque, or a koan or a teaching like Shunyata, and you maybe you read about it, you listen to teachings about it, you try to get what the teaching is pointing at, and I think eventually it gets integrated somehow. It gets internalized, and it's no longer, the Dharma is no longer separate from you. Your life is, everything you do is the Dharma. So it's no longer something out there or something in a book. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Tanya.
I have come across, I was reading a book about history of mathematics, and I have come across a statement that the concept of zero originated in India, and that it was probably made possible because of the acceptance of the concept of emptiness, that is not actually zero, but like a placeholder.
Uh-huh.
And I thought that was quite an interesting junction between Buddhism and,
Yeah.
shall we call it, empirical sciences. So.
Uh-huh. I thought that zero came from Islam, Muslim cultures, but I could be wrong. But there is a lot of historical evidence that the Prajnaparamita Sutras were widespread throughout the Silk Route in China and India, all through, and the Persian Empire was a huge rich trading empire. And there's some evidence that the Prajnaparamita Sutras were in pre-Socratic Greece even. So you have Plato talking about the one and the many. And so I think there was a lot of cross-fertilization between India and the Persian Empire, and they both influenced each other. So in India, in early India, they didn't have a lot of sculptures of figures in the early, and then you start seeing these early Buddha statues that are coming up in India, and they look very Apollonian, very Greek. There's some in the museum here in Chicago. If you go in that room where they have all those hundreds of Buddhas, it's amazing. And there's some very early Buddhas that look very much like Apollo, and they're beautiful. So I think there was a lot of cross-fertilization going on in all of those cultures. Yeah. So that's probably enough for today. We're on the last leg of this retreat. So if you've been in this retreat for 7 days, I would recommend that you start to relax a little. And if you have family members or people around you and you haven't been talking, you might want to start kind of weaning yourself out of this retreat by starting to relax and talk and enjoy others as a way of transitioning out of the retreat back into your regular life. I think it's important that you make that transition. If you're in a 3-day retreat, it may not be so extreme for you, and you may want to keep sitting more sitting, intensely through the end of the day. It's really up to you. But generally, when we're in a 7-day retreat, at this point in the retreat, I encourage people to talk when they feel like it, if you haven't been talking, and to start to transition out of the retreat. And just be aware that especially if you're in the 7-day retreat, you are dilated and in an altered state of consciousness. You've got to be careful when you go outside. Just be aware that you're in a slightly altered state, especially when you're driving a car or operating machinery or something. So we'll have sitting this afternoon at 3, or practice of immediacy, and then we will do council circle at 7, and that will be our closing program for the spring retreat. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for your practice.